Today's book is Being Wagner, The Triumph of the Will by Simon Callow. It's a biography of the famous 19th century classical music composer Richard Wagner. Richard Wagner, if you're not familiar with him, was a opera writer, well, classical music and opera in Germany in the 19th century. From Germany, he lived all over. He's most famous for those operas with the Vikings in them. You've seen this parodied, I'm sure, in a million pop culture places, the, Looney Tunes and what have you. The fat woman wearing the Viking helmet. All the operas about Vikings in German mythology are Wagner. And of course, he's also most famous for the Ride of the Valkyries theme, as featured probably most prominently in the movie Apocalypse Now. You will recognize it when you hear it. It's the one that goes dun 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 dun. I promise I will not sing any more in this review. That's me done singing for the rest of the review. But that's the song. So yeah, if you don't know who Richard Wagner is, that's who he is. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about my own interests and biases, because that's going to affect how I approach this review. I am not a classical music guy. I mean, I've tried to get into it, I've tried to listen to classical music, but I just can't appreciate it. It's my own failing. I'm a bit of a Philistine in that account. I am, however, a history nerd. And so sometimes if you're a history nerd, you can take an interest in the biography of famous composers, especially if their biographies intersect with history or politics. And Wagner certainly did. He played a prominent role in the revolutions of 1848. In 1848, he was an associate of the famous Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin. He later became very active in anti-Semitism, or very vocal about anti-Semitism. And in the 20th century, there's been much debate about his legacy because he had been interested in the myths of German nationalism, and because he had been so anti-Semitic. Hitler was a big fan of Wagner, and so there was some association with Wagner and the Nazis. And to this day, there is an informal ban on performing Wagner in Israel. You can look this up on Wikipedia. Search under Wagner controversies, I think. There's a section on Wagner in Israel. He's not formally banned, but whenever anyone tries to stage one of his concerts in Israel, there's all sorts of protests, is my understanding. So, I mean, obviously that's not a good thing, but I was nevertheless intrigued by the contrast. Wagner, who in 1848 was throwing in his lot with the leftists and the socialists and the anarchists, and then later goes on to be a symbol of the ultra-right with the Nazis in Germany. And this had long been a source of fascination to me, trying to reconcile these two different versions of Wagner and what was really going on here. The other thing that interests me, and this comes from my interest in mythology and just also being a fantasy nerd, is I was always very curious to know what was the plot of Wagner's Ring Cycle. So, he did a number of operas, but the most infamous of which was his famous Ring Cycle about German mythology, which was divided into 4 nights. I think each night was 3 hours each, so it's like a 12-hour long opera. Now, as somebody who has no patience for opera, I'm not going to sit through all 12 hours of the Ring Cycle, but I'd be quite interested in reading a condensed version of it, finding out what the plot was, or, what the influences was, or what the stories were. So that's what I was interested in with the biography of Wagner, something that touched on his political life, the contradictions in the man, and something that explored the mythological themes in his work, and perhaps even gave a summary, like, the Cliff Notes version of his opera. I've actually been looking for a readable biography of Wagner for quite some time. About a little over 10 years ago, actually, I read and reviewed a book called Wagner, A Documentary Study, which was very dry and boring and academic, but I read it because it was just the only thing I could find in my library at the time. I was living out in Japan at the time. I've reviewed that book on this YouTube channel, actually, if you're interested in. Although I didn't get much out of it. This book I stumbled upon in the bookstore a couple months ago, and I thought, great, this is what I've been looking for. A nice, readable biography on Wagner. Because, you know, I was looking for something light. I don't want a serious academic study. I want an armchair read. Something that's written for a popular audience and very easy to read. And this is written for a popular audience and very easy to read. The author is not an academic. He's an actor, Simon Callow, who I don't know a lot about other than the blurb on the back. Looks like he was in at least one movie I saw, 4 Weddings and a Funeral. I'm not sure about anything else. But he also takes an interest in theater and classical music. So he's as he talks about in the foreword to this book, talks about how he became interested in Wagner and how he ended up researching the book. So it's very readable. It's not academic at all. Yeah, so about the content of the book, it does a very good job, it does a decent job of talking about the various political contradictions in Wagner, and gives a very interesting account of his involvement in 1848, his involvement with some of the socialists there. I mean, 1848... Revolutions of 1848 are a whole different subject, and actually, if you're interested, I've reviewed a different book, Revolutions of 1848, on this channel, but just to summarize briefly, it was kind of a mix of both Republican and socialist revolutionaries at the barricades. But Wagner seems to have been associated with some of the more left-leaning socialist ones, and, of course, Mikhail Bakunin, the famous anarchist. In fact, there's a line about Mikhail Bakunin here on page 78, who, was an associate of Wagner's in the revolutions of 1848. It says, it was the Russian anarchist Mikhail Bakunin, the most notorious terrorist in the world, the Osama bin Laden of his day, with a hefty bounty on his head. So that's how they introduced Mikhail Bakunin in this book. And it goes on to say that he walked into the room where Wagner was playing and gave him a big embrace, and talks about the whole relationship between Bakunin and Wagner. I am not sure that description is entirely fair. And granted, this is probably a nitpick, given that Mikhail Bakunin is a minor figure in this book. I mean, it's a nitpick in terms, at least in far as the goals of this particular book are concerned. But yeah, with regard to Bakunin, Bakunin also is an interesting person and somebody I've done other videos on reviewing books about him. My impression is that Bakunin was not a pacifist. You know, he was somebody who advocated violence. But I don't think he advocated terrorism. I think he advocated insurrectionism. I think he was an insurrectionist, if that makes sense. So he was all for the barricades, he was all for fighting on the barricades and revolution, but I don't think he was for blowing up, you know, throwing bombs into a crowded cafe full of civilians, or, you know, those things we associate with terrorists. And especially nowadays, when we associate terrorists with kind of mass violence against civilians, I don't think that's fair to say that about Mikhail Bakunin. I don't think the comparison with Osama bin Laden is fair, except, I don't know, maybe it's accurate insofar as to say he was as notorious in his day as Osama bin Laden was notorious in our day. maybe you can make that notoriety comparison. But I don't think their means or methods were at all comparable. I don't think Mikhail Bakunin was a terrorist in the modern sense in terms of bombing civilians. That being said, I am not an expert on anything. So by all means, if somebody knows more about this than me, feel free to comment down below. I have seen Mikhail Bakunin described as I have seen Mikhail Bakunin described as a terrorist occasionally before. I've never really seen a good reason for it, but there could well be something I don't know. So let me know. Anyways, moving on. It also talks about Wagner's anti-Semitism. Now, something I said in a previous video I did on Wagner, and something I had picked up from the Revolutions podcast by, what's his name, Mike Duncan. He was actually doing a podcast on Bakunin, who was actually also a rabid anti-Semite. And Mike Duncan said, well, you've got to take all of this with a certain grain of salt, because in the 19th century, everybody was anti-Semitic. I hope that's an accurate paraphrase of what he said. And so that was somewhat on the back of my mind when I started this book. But the author makes it very clear, Simon Callow makes it very clear, that although there was, to a certain extent, a general anti-Semitism in the 19th century, Wagner went above and beyond that general anti-Semitism. He was obsessed with his hatred of the Jews. And he got himself in trouble even during his time. Even during his time, people were like, whoa, okay, he's a little bit extreme. He's gone a little bit crazy with this whole anti-Jewish thing. It talks about how Wagner published articles on, the problem of the Jews, that his friends told him, don't publish this, this is going to cause you trouble. And, he published it, and it cost him certain opportunities. It closed certain doors to him because he was so vocal about his anti-Semitism. And it's a curious quirk. Where does this come from? Why was Wagner so obsessed with this? What did Jews ever do to him? And Simon Callow tries to tease this out a little bit. And with apologies, I'm not going to do justice to it. He talks a little bit about how Wagner had this vision of how modern society was corrupting people. Kind of like the modern hippies in the 1960s or something like that, where we need to go back to nature and rediscover human goodness. And he says in order to kind of have this vision of human nature being corrupted, you need to then have some sort of villain who's responsible for corrupting human nature. And, maybe to the hippies, this was the military or the capitalist or something like that. To Wagner in the 19th century, the natural scapegoat for this would be the Jews, the merchants of the world who are always obsessed about money or something like that. But another point he makes in this book is that Wagner could just be a little bit single-minded, not only about the Jews, but about various things, where once he got his mind fixed around something, he just obsessed about it. Although he was, again, this comes through from the book, he was a man of contradictions because he did have Jewish friends. And especially near the end of his life, when he was the most anti-Semitic, arguably, he had a couple close Jewish friends who were staying at his house and who were devoted followers to him. So he mentions those paradoxes. He doesn't really explain them, except really there's nothing to explain. It's just a strange paradox in Wagner. I was thinking about this a little bit as I read the book, and this is my own personal opinion. But I wonder if it's... how nowadays people always say, well, I can't be racist because I have black friends. That's like a cliche of like a flimsy excuse for a racist. Wagner had Jewish friends, even though he was anti-Semitic. And I was thinking, I was thinking, I bet racists do really have black friends. Because the thing about racism is it's not logical. It's some sort of primal, emotional, tribal impulse. Like, this is the in-group, this is the out-group. And I mean, I'm sure there are some sort of analytical and logical racists out there somewhere. But I think the vast majority of them, the primary emotion is not rational. And so to look for consistency in a racist applying their racism, or in Wagner applying his anti-Semitism, there's no consistency to it. That's somewhat of a digression. That was my own thoughts as I read about the paradoxes of Wagner's life. There is then an interesting afterword to this, where it talks about Wagner's legacy. And I thought this was very interesting, because it talks about how there was a battle for his legacy among his surviving family members. And it didn't have to end up that he was appropriated by the Nazis. It could have gone the other way. For example, Wagner's son, Siegfried, was a homosexual, a liberal, and took great care to distance himself from his father's anti-Semitism. So, it says in this book that he got complaints that Jews were attending some of his father's operas. This was after his father had died, so, his father's operas being performed later. And he replied, whether a person is Chinese, a Negro, an American, a Red Indian, or a Jew is a matter of complete indifference to us. So he completely rejected the anti-Semitism or racial purity of his father, or those people who would want to appropriate his father's legacy. But what's interesting is he died in 1930, and then his wife, who was actually not German, but English. He was a homosexual, but he had married apparently to escape scandal. Even though she was English, she was absolutely infatuated with Hitler. And then she was kind of in control of the Wagner family legacy from the 1930s, and that was a cause of the close association with Hitler and the Nazi Party, at least according to this book. But then what I found even more interesting yet is Hitler really loved Wagner, but the rest of the Nazi Party did not. So it said that Hitler tried to stage some of Wagner's operas at the Nuremberg rally. So he filled the opera hall with Nazi Party members, but they got bored, fell asleep, or talked amongst themselves, and then just drank themselves into a stupor. And Hitler got so upset about it that he never did any more Wagner concerts at all. Yeah, okay. But the other interesting thing was, I'm going to quote from the book here. It says, "But the rank and file's boredom and boorishness were the least of the problem. The more intellectually acute of the high command pointed out that the Ring of Nibelung," that this is like Wagner's famous opera cycle, was a proto-Marxist text. So, here Hitler is embracing this, thinking this is supporting his ideology of the far right. And the intellectuals in the Nazi Party are going like, wait, this is actually a Marxist opera that we're putting on. Yeah, fascinating, huh? It gets back to Wagner's contradictions. And, again, in the 1848, it sounded like he was very sympathetic to the socialist revolutionaries. So, all that was very interesting, and an incredibly readable biography. Now, what I did not get from this book, and what I was a little bit disappointed from, is I still don't have any idea of the plot of Wagner's operas. I was hoping for like a Cliff Notes version of what actually the plot of the Ring cycle is. And, maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm the only person who was who was interested in that, and other readers will be just fine. But yeah, I'd just be really interested to have an analysis of, what are the plots, what are the themes of the Ring Cycle. And he talks about the themes of Wagner's work in the abstract, but it would just be really nice to go into more detail. For example, this is on page 104. It's talking about Wagner's opera, The Rheingold. And it says, quoting, "It embodied with an amazing dexterity, within its unbroken 2.5-hour span, Wagner's tragic critique of modern capitalism, grounded in his understanding of Feuerbach." I believe Feuerbach was one of the early socialists. "And channeled through figures derived from the ancient myths of the German people." Okay, so that's all very interesting. But what were the critiques of modern capitalism? How did Wagner ground this in his early understanding of Feuerbach? What ancient myths of the German people did he use? I would have been really interested to know this stuff. And it's mentioned in generalities here, but I would have loved to have a summary of the plots of Wagner's opera, or the myths that Wagner was using. I suppose that's all probably on Wikipedia somewhere. But yeah, the other thing, going back to that Nazi quote I was just mentioning, how the Nazi high command was noticing that the Ring of Nibelung was a proto-Marxist text. It's stated there, but it's not explained. I would have been really curious to know, okay, what are the proto-Marxist themes in this opera? If somebody could have explained that to me, I think the book would have been that much more interesting. So it could have been more interesting, but it was still plenty interesting as it was. It was still a very interesting, very readable biography of a fascinating man. Very readable. It comes in at about 200 pages plus some brief notes at the end. At the end, there's a chronology here, as these books sometimes do, where it goes through the major events in Wagner's life. And it was notable reading the chronology, all the things that didn't make it into the text. So, I'm reading through and I'm like, wait, I don't remember that. Was that in the book? Did I miss it? And I go through and I check, and no, sure enough, it was not in the book. So, evidently, some of the major events of Wagner's life have gotten left out. But I suspect that was intentional, that maybe he was working with an editor, and they really wanted to make this a slim, readable, breezy 200 pages. So, you get what you pay for. I mean, I guess there's no sense picking up a book like this, which, you can tell right from the cover that it's not meant to be scholarly. No point picking up a book like this and then complaining that it wasn't the most thorough treatment of Wagner's life and works ever. There is a interesting section on the bibliography and other recommended reading, which does give suggestions for other works you can read. And it sounds like some of these works may actually get into more of the themes that I was interested in. I actually, 10 years ago when I was looking for a very readable biography on Wagner, I was searching Amazon.com and I was not coming up with a lot, which led me to believe that maybe there just wasn't a lot written for a general public. But there actually is a lot in this bibliography. I think maybe the lesson to be learned here is that searching Amazon.com is maybe not the most thorough way of seeing what books are out there. I used to assume that if it was published, it was available on Amazon, but maybe that was a misassumption. Okay, anything else to say about this book? I think I might leave it there. There's a lot more things that happen in this book. There's a lot more interesting episodes in Wagner's life, his marital problems, his some of the marriage scandals, his relationship with the King of Germany and the political upheaval or problems that this caused. So there's more interesting details in here, but for more interesting details, I guess just check out the biography yourself. If you're interested in a good biography, I recommend it. And again, this is coming from somebody who is a complete Philistine as far as music is concerned. So you don't have to know anything about classical music. You just have to be interested in biography, and I think you'll enjoy this book.